Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored, Never Boring, and another episode of 10 Paints or Less, in which I attempt to paint something using 10 paints or less. Today I'm going to be painting Duncan Reid from Anima Tactics, and basically going to be sort of showcasing doing some dark armour. Doing a lot of painting using washes. So this is Duncan Reid. He has been primed, he's a metal miniature, and he has been spray primed with Chaos Black. Because that's a good base for doing something which is predominantly metal, and he is a predominantly metal miniature, so I'm going to be using an M base brush to apply lead belcher, and you will see that lead belcher will be covering most of this miniature. He is almost entirely covered in armor except for his head. So I'm just trying to get the right consistency for the paint here, and I only apply a single coat. That's good enough for what I'm doing here, because what we're going to do, we're going to try and make this armor very, very dark. There's a picture of Duncan Reid in the Anima Tactics rules book showing his armor as being very dark. So I'm going to be using some washes to really try and make almost like a black knight. So that's the with the lead belcher applied, you can see it is incredibly bright and very shiny and metallic. It doesn't look very realistic or like armour at all at the moment. So good old Nuln Oil shade to the rescue. I'm going to be using my medium shade brush, and I am going to slosh Nuln Oil over the whole thing. I don't need to be too picky about it. Just going to cover the whole thing. And that will really knock down that shine, obviously. Whilst also bringing out some definition on the miniature, on the chainmail links and things like that. But we're not done there. It's still not looking like very dark black armor. So I've got some purple tone here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mix some purple tone with some Nuln Oil to make a very dark, slight purple tinged wash. And that's going to go over the whole model again, and that's going to make it darker still, but also give it like yeah, it's going to give it like a little purple hue. So I'm just fiddling about here on my mixing paper, trying to get a colour that I'm happy with. And then that will go over everything except for the swords. The sword blades are going to be a shinier metal. And finally, what I'm doing here is I'm applying neat purple tone wash to, there's a lion chest plate and 2 lion pauldrons on the armor, and I want those to be more purple still. I want those to kind of stand out as being more significant than the rest of the armor. So that's basically a Nuln Oil wash, then a mix wash, and then a purple tone wash, and you can see now it's looking very dark. The wash has brought out a lot of definition of the miniature, and the armor is much, much darker than it was after just the first Nuln Oil wash. But we are now going to go back to lead belcher, and I'm going to do a very, very, very light dry brush. I don't want to do it too much, because otherwise I'm going to undo all the work that I've just done with all the washes. It's going to make it too metallic again. I want it to be a dark purple hued armor. I don't want it to look really shiny and metallic, but I do want to bring out a lot of the definition and detail. So I'm using a small dry brush, and I'm just doing the edges of the swords, and then I will do just over the body of the armor, just to bring out details on things like the lion's heads and things like that. And like I say, I don't want to go too crazy with it, because it will undermine, it will start making the armor too bright again, and I don't want to do that. And there we go. And if I turn this miniature around, you can see the difference between the swords and the colour of the armour. You can see how much brighter and more metallic the swords are than the very dark purple toned armour. I've now got some Ulthuan Grey, and I'm just putting that on my palette paper there, because the other element of this miniature is fur. It has fur. He's got a fur section on the front, he's got fur over his shoulders, and down his back a little ways. So I'm giving that a base coat of Ulthuan Grey. I've watered it down a little bit. I'm going to apply 2 coats. I'm just obviously going to be very careful not to get it over any of the armour that I've painted, because technically the armour is finished, and with that armour finished, 90% of this miniature is finished. So there you go, I've blocked in the fur elements on the front and the back. Doesn't look very much like fur at the moment. So once again, we are going to resort to our trusty washes, and this time I'm using Reichland Flesh Shade. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to water this down a little bit more, because it's fur, so I don't want it to have really, really stark definition. It needs to have the definition, but it is fur at the end of the day, so it needs to look a little bit more natural in terms of the shading. So it's just a very watered down single wash of Reichland Flesh Shade, just to emphasize some of the detailing on the sculpt. And there we go. You can see it's not done very much at all in terms of definition, but just enough to actually bring out those details. Now it's back to Ulthuan Grey, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix this with some Nuln Oil. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a light grey that is quite washy. And I'm going to do this to paint detailing on the fur, because the fur on the source art for this miniature is almost like a sort of white tiger. So it's got the light fur tone, and then it's got streaks of darker fur running through it. So what I'm doing is very carefully, I'm just painting like random lines and little triangles of this mix of Nuln Oil and Ulthuan Grey. And as you're applying it, you can't really see it going on. And you can see that I keep sort of adjusting, adding more Nuln Oil and things like that, different amounts of water, to try and get slightly different variations in the colour, but also to get tones that I'm happy with. And there's no real rhyme or reason to what I'm doing here. It's basically what looks good, just being a bit artistic, I guess, or as artistic as I get. There's no specific structure to what I'm doing. It's just little triangles and flicks of this light grey. Like I say, as it goes on, you can barely see it going on, but it does dry and you can tell the difference. You can see where it is. You can see that I'm actually lying the miniature down here because I don't have very steady hands. And there we go. So that is applied. And now we're switching to Monster Brown, because while that sort of wash paint mix is drying, we're just going to paint the handles on the swords. Very, very simple, just a coat of Monster Brown. Any light brown will do, really. The source miniature, he actually has metallic handles on his swords, but this miniature was already so heavy in terms of the amount of metal on it. I wanted something else that had a slightly more natural coloration to it to go with the fur. So that is what I've done there. And now we're going back to the fur, because the ink paint wash is drying. So now we're going back to Nuln Oil again, and we are going to paint little black triangles and flecks between and sometimes slightly overlapping the light grey ones that we've done. And I'm using Nuln Oil because, again, I want it to kind of wash into the recesses and things like that. If I'm just using paint, then you get very stark, specific lines. But I want the wash to slightly bleed out into the fur to make it look like a slightly more natural, a natural coloration in the fur, rather than being stark, obviously painted black lines. And again, this is just something where you just have to eyeball it and do what makes you happy. Do what looks good. Again, you don't want to overdo it, because you don't want to just slosh black Nuln Oil over everything and undo all the previous layers of paint you've done. And painting with washes in this way is just about being careful. And there you go. You can see that's the result you're getting. And now we've got the Reikland Fleshblade, and this is just to go over the handles of the swords, to put some definition on those brown handles, to make them look like they've been wrapped in leather or something. And again, just being very, very careful. When you're doing washes like this, just be careful not to keep sloshing it over bits you've already painted. And there we go. This is basically done. Apart from, we obviously need to deal with his face and his hair. Now, in the image, he's kind of like a bleached blonde, almost like a beach bum type character. He's got sort of a very strong anime vibe. So I've gone for tanned flesh. I probably went a little bit too dark in terms of... I wanted to make him look tanned, but I think I went a little bit too far in terms of this particular example. But it is what it is. So I'm just very carefully just applying a base coat of the tanned flesh. Obviously making sure I don't go over the armour, but not worrying about going over the hair. And then Reikland Flesh shade to shade the face. And there we go. So what I'm doing here is I'm just going back to the original tanned flesh colour, watering it down just a little bit more, and I'm going to do a highlight over the brow, the forehead, the bridge of the nose, the cheeks, things like that, just to emphasise the prominent facial features. So again, I'm going to lie my miniature almost down and just very, very carefully flicking it on. You can go further with this than I did, but obviously this is 10 paints or less, so I'm trying to minimise the amount of paints I use. Next we're going back to Monster Brown, and we're going to give a base coat of Monster Brown to his hair. And that's because I want to try and get sort of a dark blonde with highlights hair type look going on here. So a flat coat of the Monster Brown is a good base coat. And there it is. Once again, we're going back to Reikland Flesh shade. And that is going to go just over the hair. Obviously being very careful not to slosh it all over the face that we've just dealt with. We don't want to knock down the highlights that we've just put back on the face. So I'm putting it on my palette here, on my palette paper, just to make sure I'm not getting too much on my brush, and then very carefully applying it over the hair. And then we're going to Skeleton Bone, and Skeleton Bone is going to be to apply the highlights to the hair. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use an Insane Detail brush, and you can see that I'm rolling the brush as I put it through the paint, and that's just to make sure I've got a good point on the brush. And then I'm going to very carefully follow the contours of the hair, follow the sculpt lines, and just put that bleached bone just on those top edges of the hair, so you're still seeing the Monster Brown below. And this is just about being careful. It's about taking your time. And there you go. And also what I've done is, while I have my Insane Detail brush out, I put a small amount of Ulthuan Grey into the eyes. Now, I didn't use white for the eyes, because if you use white, there's an opportunity for the eyes to look really wide and staring and crazy. And now I'm going for Nuln Oil. And what I'm going to do with the Nuln Oil is I'm going to paint the eyeballs. I'm going to paint the pupils for the eyes. And again, I'm not using black paint. I'm using the wash, because you can get a little bit more control over applying such a small dot of black, but also it's slightly less stark. If you use white and then a black pupil, your miniature can look like it's staring like psychotically. But by using the Ulthuan Grey and then using the Nuln Oil to dot in the pupil, it's a slightly more toned down, slightly more natural look to it. And again, it's just about being very, very careful. And there we go. With the eyes painted, the hair painted, the arms painted, it's all done. And you can see the difference between the sword and the armour there. The last thing I'm going to do is, just because I can, I've got a paint spare in my 10 paints or less, I'm going to just do a dry brush of shining silver just on the swords, just to make them a little bit brighter still. And again, this is just very, very fine edge dry brush. You could do an edge highlight instead. I tend not to do very much in the way of edge highlighting because, like I say, I don't have very steady hands. But there we go. That is the finished miniature. Obviously, he needs to be based up, and I'm going to put him on a base that I made in a previous video. I made a base that is a pillar with a vine coming out of it. And there we go. And that is what he looks like. All done on his base, ready for action. And I'm going to throw up the original source image so that you can sort of see where I went from. I deviated ever so slightly. There's not quite as much fur on mine. And obviously I changed the handle on the swords. But it's an approximation of the original source artwork. And very, very quick to do, almost entirely metal with shades. The only shades I used were non-oil Reichland Flesh shade and the purple tone. And by using those three, it did a lot of the painting work for me. And I think it came out looking like quite a dark Black Knight type armor. I'm pretty happy with the results. Obviously, expert painters may well have gone with like a non-metallic metal armor or something like that to get these hues, but I don't have that kind of talent. But anyway, I hope that you have found this interesting, and I will see you all again very soon. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.